I want to welcome you. My name is Ellen Bennett. I have the privilege of being on the board of directors of the Brunswick-Topsham Land Trust. And before that, I was on the board of directors of the Cadance River Education Alliance. And as many of you know, CREA's educational initiatives now work through and are part of the Land Trust, our school programs, summer camp, and our community talks here at the library. These are just some of the things that take place through the Land Trust. As you, many of you know, how many of you are members of the Land Trust? Okay, well, you know everything already. I really don't need to go through all of this, do I? I will tell you that we just finished up another very successful summer camp and filled all of our weeks, and we had a waiting list again, and so our educational initiatives are going strong. These are some upcoming events through the Land Trust and CREA. Welcome. You don't have to really look for a seat, they're right here. And we have walks and talks. And our next Topsham public library talk will be on the 22nd, Fighting the Hemlock Woolly Adelgid, with Steve Walker, who is the current executive director of the Land Trust, and Margaret Gerber, who is an amazing, what is her title? She's stewardship director. She's awesome. And Jan, who helped put together these slides. These are some slides of the woolly adelgids. That's correct. Yeah. As a colleague of ours wrote in the paper a few weeks ago, he wrote an article about this called Meet the Beatles. And it was very, very informative, very good. So, and they're bringing the Beatles over with them. Oh, smart. I just wanted to add one note before I introduce our speaker, and that is to thank you all for your membership, because our members are really the heartbeat of our organization. So we thank you for your support and your interest in what we do. And now to our program and to our speaker, Matt Nixon, who was also on CREA's board. I got to know him then when we served together. It was lovely. He is the owner of Muddy Ritter Aquaponics, Mary Meeting Shell. That's a mouthful. Shellfish Company. Are there two different companies? Thank you. Thank you. He also, an MRF Consulting, LLC. He works part-time as an offshore wind project manager for a consulting firm called Tetra Tech. He worked for the state of Maine's Coastal Zone Management Program for 11 years, 8 of them as deputy director. And during his tenure, he oversaw a variety of technical assistance grant programs for harbor and wharf development, founded the state seafloor mapping program, and led the siting process for Maine's 3 ocean energy test sites near Boone, Damaris Cove, and Monhegan Islands. He resigned from the state in 2019 to focus on his PhD work in Orono and spend more time with his growing family. He was also exhausted. It was during this period that he also ran for and was elected to Topsham Select Board, where he's now in his 2nd term and serves as vice chair. He spends his free time in the woods with the dogs, boating on the Kennebec, playing with his amazing kids, growing rainbow trout in the backyard, and looking for opportunities for his wife to leave state service as well as reduce her stress load, and he's accomplished that. Jess will be beginning to work with the Brunswick-Topsham Land Trust in a week, and we're very excited. She did. So, Matt, welcome, and thank you very much. We look forward to hearing from you.
All right. I think Ellen and Doug can both attest this. I usually don't dress this nicely, but I've been in a conference all day down in Portland for offshore wind, and I have not been home yet. So you actually get to see Matt not in his Tevas.
If I take this guy.
Perfect.
Oh, you got that, Jan? Okay.
Thank you, Jen. That is the wrong slide. So Ellen, thank you for that intro. I am up to 3 companies at this point, but they're all somewhat incestuously connected. So um, I worked for the state for 11 years, as Ellen had mentioned, and 8 of those were with the previous administration, which, for someone who wants to do something and make a difference in the world, that was not the administration to work for. So 2019, obviously, Governor Mills came in office. The one agency that did not get new leadership was mine. So I was still stuck with what I had been stuck with for the past 8 years, and it was time for a change because I was not going through that again. So quit in 2019. Actually jumped on the comp plan committee at one point with Doug, and dipped my toes in the water in town government. A lot of fun. Still doing it because I am a masochist and I don't have enough going on. So, founded Muddy River Farm Aquaponics in my backyard in November of 2019. As you know, it's probably arguably the worst time to start a business in recent memory because about 4 months later, the entire world ended as we knew it, and everything shut down. But it was what's the word I'm looking for here? It was a gift because I was able to spend that time, and like everybody else in America, I built a barn in my backyard, and using that barn, it was purpose built for aquaponics, which is essentially you grow fish in one area and you grow plants in another, and the fish poop, they fertilize the plants then remove ammonia, well, not always, but um, clean the water, send it back to the fish tank. So it's sort of an enclosed ecosystem that's self-sustaining. The only thing you have to add is fish feed, and that's really about it. During that time, I had been growing some fish, a bunch of rainbow trout, grew quite a few of them. Many of them jumped out, and my dog ended up eating them, which is fantastic. It's good protein for her. It was a win-win. During this time, I was using some of the revenue from the small produce sales I was doing to cover my overhead for this, which is it's not aquaponics; it's a recirculating system. It's what the system, when you're growing shellfish on land, it's called a recirculating system. Even though a lot of times you'll have water being taken in from the ocean, flooded around, and then eventually discharged back. So that's called a semi-enclosed recirculating system. There are quite a few of them. This is nothing new. People have been growing shellfish on land, mostly in academic settings for a while, and that's mainly just for testing different disease-resistant strains, seeing if they can actually hatch something successfully. But given my experiences with the state and everything I had seen over the last 10 years, or 11 years, in terms of climate change impacts, this was something I really wanted to get into because the ocean is changing faster than most of us have ever predicted, and it is easily the largest driver of our climate in the state, or in the country, I should say, in terms of carbon, serving as a carbon sink, controlling our weather patterns. You name it, the ocean does it. And if we don't know what the ocean is doing anymore, it becomes really hard for people who make a living on the ocean to continue making that living. So this is just real brief, basically what I just told you. So you don't have to bother reading all those words. Just to reemphasize that point. So I mean, everybody's seen the quote that the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than all but 2 areas on the face of the planet. The Gulf of Maine Research Institute has gotten a crapload of federal funding because of that statement, and so they're going to keep milking it. It is true, though you have to think about geological time, right? We humans have been here for less than a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a flash in the pan. And when we're looking at a 10-year period, 2011 through 2021, yes, the trend is true. It is warming very dramatically. But if you look at a longer trend, maybe 40 years, that warming trend isn't as dramatic. What is concerning is that the rate is not natural, I think, as you all know. I mean, clearly, we don't get snow anymore. The mud flats don't freeze over. All we do is get ice. Things are changing very rapidly. And trying to get ready for that from a business perspective is more or less why I founded this company. Because Lord knows the state was not doing it for the last 8 years. They are now, but we wasted almost a decade there. So when I first started working for Maine, the epicenter for lobster landings was in Stonington. That's still pretty high up there. I think it's like second or sometimes first. It alternates in terms of value of the landings. Now the epicenter is in the Chias. So if you just think about that trend, this was a period of 11 years, this migration. And you ask anyone at the Department of Marine Resources if lobsters are going away, and they'll be like, absolutely not. But the science says otherwise. I mean, we still have lobsters in Long Island Sound. I think there's one lobsterman left on LIF. And then Zone G, which is basically right here, the coast is divided up into zones from G all the way to A. Zone G, lobster management area, is they still have an industry. It's not like lobsters have gone away. They just have a much more prolific occurrence of shell disease, which you can eat a lobster with shell disease, you just can't sell it because it looks hideous, and it would demand nothing at the market. But industry's still there, just nowhere near the same kind of numbers or landings or economic value that you find up here. And that's also distorting because, I mean, once, as some of you may know, once you get into Hancock, Washington County, you've got blueberries and you've got lobsters and MDI. So if one of those industries goes out, it has a massive community-wide impact. It's not like, you know, a mill going out down in Westbrook, because people can rebound from that. But up there, there's really not a whole lot else going on that you can make a living off of, and that's their tradition as well, making a living off the ocean. So with that in mind, I started thinking about, okay, how can these guys continue to make a living off the ocean? How can we continue to enjoy eating sea or protein from the sea in light of everything that's going on? As far as I'm concerned, and I'm a child of the 80s, we missed our chance to really nip this climate change thing in the bud in the 90s. And the best that we can do at this point is adapt and mitigate. That's a very cynical point of view, but I think the weather's sort of proven my point over the last 5 or 6 years here. It's a very unfortunate set of circumstances we find ourselves in, and my daughters are even going to have a more rough time. Fortunately, they don't have asthma yet, you know, fingers crossed. So my friend over in Brunswick, he's the coastal resource manager over there, gave me this equation: abatements, mitigation, adaptation plus persistence equals resilience. And I thought that was a really neat way to phrase it. Aquaculture is an incredibly sustainable industry. There's a lot of misinformation out there about aquaculture, and most of it comes from one woman who runs a PR firm down in Portland and is funded by 3 months out of the year homeowners, mainly in Brunswick and Waldoboro, to basically stop all forms of aquaculture development because people don't want to see it when they come up here. It is far more present, at least in terms of visual impacts, than lobstering, though oyster farmers aren't out at 4 o'clock in the morning rolling coal in their diesel boat, blasting WBLM and shooting seals and all that good stuff like other industries in Maine are. So there's sort of a trade-off there. Aquaculture is one of the fastest growing industries in the state. Grows on the East Coast between 7 to 10% every year. And trying to understand what some of those industry excuse me, let me back up. I approached the Maine Technology Institute very early on because I had an idea about a recirculating system that you could put in a garage and grow oysters there without needing the ocean. Because when you remove the ocean from the equation, you take away pathogens that are coming up here from the south, you take away fluctuating water temperatures trending warmer, you take away acidification. You just need to pick up the paper and read about the harmful algal blooms that are occurring right now all over the place. Brunswick had a really nasty one last year. A lot of that's tied to nitrogen getting into the water from grass fertilizer, which of course happens much more now because we have these massive rain events where it just dumps for maybe half an hour and then it's over. But you get basically an entire day's worth of rain in half an hour. So you've got a lot more nutrients flooding into McCoy Bay, Brunswick. I mean, anywhere really where you have lush green lawns, and Maine has a lot of those. So for those reasons and many others, I approached MTI about funding this wacky idea, because that's what MTI is for. It's to basically pick up projects that a bank wouldn't have remotely even considered funding through a business loan, and they would have shown me the door immediately. So that's MTI's job. MTI gave me a $24,999 grant in 2021 to essentially provide proof of concept through industry surveys. So at that point, I had one part-time staffer, and her entire job was traveling the coast talking to aquaculturists. And what we were trying to figure out was what were the impediments to growing the industry, and whether or not a recirculating system such as the one I proposed would actually benefit the industry. So we got about 32 hours. You can read that. In terms of interviews, the top 3 issues that we encountered were the cost of gear, which basically needs to be replaced every 2 years or so. The cost of labor, which, I mean, everybody's dealing with that, which is good. That's a good thing. We're finally getting up to like livable wages for the most part here. And then obviously the availability of seed. In Maine, every single oyster you eat comes from one of 3 hatcheries. There are import rules in place in Maine where hatcheries can't, or farmers can't import seed from out of Maine. And that's really to keep what's going on down at the New York Bight, New Jersey, and everything else down there. It'll get up here eventually, but this policy essentially locks in, well, it benefits me, obviously, but at the same time, it benefits everyone because we don't have these things that we have to keep looking for every year, new pathogens. It's a mess down south of New York Bight in terms of pathogens. They basically have everything under the sun going on with some of their shellfish industry right now. So seed availability is an issue because this regulation prohibits seed importation, and when I say seed, spat is another name that people use, baby oysters up to about 2 millimeters in size. So if one of the 3 hatcheries in the state goes out, it causes a massive snowball effect in the industry where you have farmers racing all over the place looking for seed because you can't import it. This happened in 2021. Mook Sea Farm lost something like 280 million spat. And I was doing the survey at the time, and come August, you could actually see when it was happening because every farmer we talked to was absolutely panicking. I was in a Mere Point Oyster Company's office one morning, and their owner got a call in the middle of the interview, and he's like, "Sorry, there's a million seed over at Muskoka's, got to go." Dropped the phone, took off. But I mean, it was pretty crazy. And honestly, aquaculture in the northern latitudes is a very compressed season. We have about 5 months to make money, and then once the water temperature gets cold, there's no more food in the water column. Oysters go dormant, and that's it. So you got to work your butt off all summer to make money. And if you don't have seed coming in that you were originally counting on, that's going to severely impact your bottom line and your ability to employ other Mainers, that sort of thing. Yada, yada, yada. So the concept, as I said, recirculating is nothing new. People do it in academic settings all the time where they don't have to worry about revenue, right, or cash flow or anything like that. They're guaranteed money the next year. So what I needed to do was eliminate some of the expensive pieces of recirculation. So in this case, it's a lot cheaper to grow oysters in the water because you don't need electricity and you don't need feed. On the land you do. So this is the first concept. It looks nothing like that now, but the principle is the same, where you have a vertically oriented stack of grow bays. And you have one sump on the bottom that doubles as a photobioreactor. So you introduce Tetrasalmus algae to that bottom sump, which is what oysters eat at a certain growth phase. It self-replicates in many cases too quickly. I've had to nuke many, many, many colonies of Tetrasalmus because my oysters were turning green until I finally figured out exactly how much I should be putting in there. Again, you can eat green oysters. They just look like heck, and you wouldn't get good money for them. So the water gets pumped full of food to the top of the system, and then using gravity, so decreasing my reliance on pumps, it essentially force feeds oysters for a predetermined period of time. They're very happy because they're constantly getting fed. And this can happen any time of year. As I mentioned before, very seasonal industry up here. Typically in the winter, or around this time of year, farmers start to think about dropping their cages to the bottom of the ocean, which is where they typically spend the winter. The oysters will go dormant. They'll lose about 30% of the stock come spring when they bring their cages back up. But it's an acceptable loss. It's really the only option at this point. This past winter, a lot of anecdotes from farmers down in Casco Bay who lost their entire farm because of the nor'easters that came through. So you lose all the buoys, and then you just can't find anything anymore because it's gone, scattered all over the bottom. So in addition to growing oysters cheaply, the pod, which is what the name of the product is, was designed to basically overwinter other farmers' product as well. So that way they know exactly how much, they'll sell me their product for 5 cents, let's say, and then I'll grow it out to a predetermined size for them over the winter months, and then they'll buy it back from me at 10 cents. It's a lot more complicated than that, but that's essentially the business model. We just figure out how much they'd like, or how big they'd like them. When they take the product back from me in the spring and put it on their lease in their cages, I recommend at least a month to take on the flavor of the embayment. Every oyster in Maine is the exact same species, but it's the salinity content, the amount of nitrogen running off, all that good stuff you don't think about when you're eating a raw oyster, but really that's what gives that oyster that very particular taste. So after the pod, a winter's worth of pod production, go back on the lease for a month, and a farmer is able to fit another cohort into sales immediately instead of starting from scratch in April and waiting for that first cohort to mature by July. They can sell one April, May, and get another batch of revenue in, which means they can grow their business a little bit larger because there's no, like any farming industry or any farming business, like in order to get more product, you need more staff. To get more staff, you need more revenue. To get more revenue, you need more product. So it's just this doom loop that there needs to be intervention, and that's sort of what this is meant to do. It's I've been a bureaucrat most of my life, so some of this business jargon is new to me. What it's called a disruption, I think, is the appropriate term. So you disrupt, in a good way, the existing business system, and so this would allow farmers to predict how much money they're getting or they're going to get next year far more accurately, to not lose 30% of their stock over the winter. So again, stupid animations aside, you got Tetraselmis plus some foie gras right there. You get one happy oyster. So 2021, I signed a cooperative research and development agreement with Oak Ridge National Labs, the U.S. Department of Energy, and UMaine's Advanced Structures and Composites Center up in Orono. They're the ones with the big printer. They printed the stupid house last year, which held up my product for about 3 months while they were getting the thing off the pad. But it is amazing. It is a really cool thing that they've done up there and continue to do. So US DOE gave me the funding to take this product from this to something a little more realistic, like this. Other acknowledgments that I have to make, obviously, because I would not be here if it weren't for them, or MTI, obviously, they've given me actually 3 grants to this point. I need to update this slide. I have a significant amount of investor involvement in this, which, again, being a bureaucrat was an entirely new ecosystem for me. So just figuring out how that whole thing works was that was a learning process in and of itself. Mid-Coast Council of Governments assisted quite a bit, and obviously I've got some business loan, mainly a mortgage on my property in Bath. So, Control P. Spent about 2 years figuring out what the actual final design would look like, and testing a number of prototypes in my barn. Most of the testing was to make sure that there wasn't any leachate that we weren't aware of that was getting out into the water, because oysters are filter feeders, and whatever you have in the water, they're going to get inside themselves. So we wanted to make sure there wasn't anything harmful getting into the oysters, either from the tank or from the pods. I also wanted to make sure that the material wasn't going to degrade. It is made of basically wood flour. It's the same thing that wood pellets are made of, lumberyard scraps, and a proprietary bioresin that UMaine developed on site, and that's it. So it's 100% recyclable, unlike oyster cages, which are plastic. This is something that you can burn on a fire pit. When you drill into it, it smells like you're drilling into a 2x4. It's really cool stuff. So this would have been, I guess, winter, or maybe it looks more like spring, doesn't it? Or maybe fall. Anyway, it was in 2022. UMaine printed commercial scale pods, and you can sort of see the array here on the right, left-hand side. That's without any PVC. These were designed to basically be plug and play, so you'd only need to buy a little bit of PVC to connect the systems. They're about 6 feet. I do have a scale coming up. Stand by. So printer UMaine is when they first started printing. I got in a lot of trouble for taking that picture because I guess you weren't supposed to do that in the facility, but whatever. They published one in the Press Herald today, so I'm really going to get it from UMaine now. Oh yeah, there you go. So that's my old Jeep Cherokee, which I love and brought it out on me 2 years ago. That's an old salmon rearing tank. UMaine's Aquaculture Research Center, or ARC, used to be up in the Orono campus. It was an old chicken barn. It was falling apart, so UMaine bulldozed it last year. They're building a brand new facility, and they were basically giving away this stuff. And since I'm still a PhD student there, we got first dibs. So I get to go up. This was really fun driving on 95, especially in the Jeep. My daughter, when she was like so young, my goodness, yeah, this is like 3 years ago now. So that gives you an idea of the size of the tank itself. So this is where the photobioreactor exists. I've got a bunch of UV lights and LED lights as well as a HVAC unit that basically makes sure the water is at a constant temperature. Because if you get it above a certain temperature, they start making babies. And then I've got a system that's completely clogged with baby oysters, which is not good for what I'm trying to do here. It is later on. We'll get to that. So here's some of the testing I did. There are a lot of labs that would do all of the parameters I needed, so I ended up going to Nova Analytics, which I didn't realize was a marijuana lab. But they actually were able to do everything I needed, which was fantastic. And when I went in, they've got the drop-down menu for what kind of business are you, like a grower or a warehouse or something like that. And they clearly didn't have oyster company as a category. So I think they put me as like a greenhouse or something along those lines. But great results came back. Water was fantastic. There was nothing in it. So test results plus. Again, tested the structural integrity of the pod itself for about a year. Those are some really large jets underneath it, and I was measuring specific points underneath those jets and elsewhere to make sure that if it sustained a significant period of water pressure, it wasn't going to fall apart. The only thing it did was change color a little bit. That was about it. Aside from that, it performed very admirably. Again, I make my own salt water, which is not an ideal business solution because that stuff's not cheap. Reef crystals. I have noticed that Cantrell's has a big flatbed trailer with 4 IBC tanks on the back of it that they'll take down to Mirror Point every 3 or 4 weeks. As long as you stay under a certain threshold, you can take that water out and bring it to your facility. So I might be doing that in the future. We'll see if it's worth money buying a new flatbed trailer. So after all of that testing, put together the pod itself. Again, it functions on, this is just one layer. This is all I tested to begin with, but it functions, it's premised on unique or uniform circulation throughout this grow bay, that grow bay, and that grow bay. And that's because you want all your oysters to grow at the same rate in each grow bay. Otherwise, settling up at the end of the year with a farmer would be impossible. So I had a batch of oysters in there from Mirror Point Oyster Company and a batch from Fertile Farm. Any of you who know Rod Melanson, used to be our town planner, I was planning on putting his oysters in there. He's got a farm out in the Damascata, but then I realized that would be against state law. There are basically 2 oyster industries in the state. There's the Damascata, and then there's everybody else. And that's because the Damascata has some really nasty strains of a disease called MSX in it. It doesn't hurt us, but it will kill oysters. So the state's trying to keep it contained to the Damascata. A lot of people think the UMaine Darling Marine Center brought that stuff in the 70s when they were playing around with aquaculture, and it's just contaminated the entire river at this point, which is unfortunate. But the oysters are still delicious, so keep eating them. And I can sell them seeds, so it doesn't really matter to me. So that is testing with oysters and product in the system. Ran this for about 2 years, measuring growth rates. They were spectacular. I had about a 5% loss rate, which compared to that 30% loss rate I described earlier, is really good for a company looking at this as an option for storing their product over the winter. And I did eat some of them. They didn't taste horrible. They didn't taste great either. But again, I expected that because they're playing around in a big fiberglass tank with artificial salt water. You got to stick them on the lease for another month to take on that flavor, right? So this is some homemade stuff that I did for a backup filtration system. Oysters aren't really dirty. They do have, it's called pseudofeces, so it's not pure poop, but they do have a physical object that comes out from eating. And in order to keep the water clarity there, and again, I mentioned earlier I had way too much algae in there at one point, so I had to UV nuke the entire system and kill everything and start over again a couple of times. So these are 2 Kalamata olive barrels. The one on the left is a radial flow separator. Basically takes water from the system and then drops it to the bottom of the barrel inside a PVC pipe. And then the water flows to the top, obviously, and the pseudofeces goes to the bottom. So that I can drain through this valve after about a week any solids that are still in there. The barrel next to it is, it's a reactor that is full of, I don't know pictures of it, but they're like little balls that are made of plastic, but they have lots and lots of surface area and folds on them, and that promotes beneficial bacteria growth. So any type of ammonia or anything like that that gets past the radial flow separator, there shouldn't be ammonia in the system anyway, but in the event that there is, I also use this for my rainbow trout. It removes ammonia through a natural process with the beneficial bacteria in the reactor on the right-hand side. And I made those both for about 25 bucks. So it was a good deal. Or I could have bought them for like $5,000 online. Another backup filter system, just in case. I was using that early in the process just to make sure I wasn't going to kill anything. This is a variable speed hot tub pump. That's what drives the whole thing. Usually feed the oysters around 1,300 RPM, and I have a maintenance flow around 800 RPM just to keep water running over them. It smells real bad when you feed them because the algae is a concentrated paste that I keep in the freezer, and when you take it out and you mix it up inside here, and then it gets blown out all over the pod. It smells horrible, but it's a good thing because the oysters are being fed. That's the important part. So some computer-generated graphics that UMaine did. This is for a grant application we put in the USDA, but this gives you a little more scientific overview of what exactly the pod looks like. The one thing I do have to do in addition to PVC is I have to add a Lexan cutout to each of the grow bays, which is like fiber or plexiglass, but a little bit hardier. UMaine also did a flow dynamic study looking at dead spots. In the first iteration when we ran the pod, there were some oysters that were going slower than others. So when we ran this model, you could actually see some of the dead spots in the grow area. They weren't red, they were like green in an area right here, an area right here. So we made some modifications to the baffle, discharge baffle, which is this crescent moon shaped thing right here. So the water inflow comes behind that baffle. And the baffle, we cut apart a landscape waterfall nozzle with a bandsaw in Orono, and we duplicated the internal baffles there to make sure that we had an equal distribution of water throughout the entire grow bag. So we made a few adjustments. Pod was a success, so the next step was to commercialize it. This is my building in Bath 2 years ago now, or 1 year ago now. It's in much rougher shape than it is now. It has a new roof, everything's painted. I still haven't figured out what I'm going to do with those boarded up windows. This is by the north end boat ramp, right across from the poop plants. It's a beautiful spot if you can just look over the sewage treatment plant, and they're amazing people too. They loan me ladders and hammers all the time. So it's about 15,000 square feet. The algae room is on the 3rd floor. So again, I use gravity to feed them. Gravity comes down or pushes the algae to the 2nd floor, which is where the pods are right now. That's a picture of the 2nd floor. The previous occupant was BIW. They made some kind of weaponized jet ski in there, and only made one of them. So they had these different stations on the 2nd floor, including this big installation of steel along the floor to make sure that the jet ski didn't go through the floor while they were building it. They got a great photo off of Senator Collins, and then the project was over, and the building was for sale. So it's a great building, 201 years old, but it's got tons of space and a lot of character. And we've spent a lot of money making sure that it's USDA certified. So, Mary Meeting Shellfish Company, this is a slightly different track, and I promise I'm almost done here. So the bath building, the pod, that's all for intermediate growth. That's for storage, overwintering. In bath, I offer cold storage, which is basically like what farmers do now, except on land in a climate-controlled tank where I keep the temperature down and they don't grow. That's the cheapest form of storage I have. The next step up is cooler storage, which for some reason farmers love cooler storage. I guess it's easier to access their product. A lot of farmers don't actually live on the coast because they can't afford it. So they don't have any waterfront property where they can land their catch or put in a walk-in cooler. So I offer walk-in cooler service at my facility as well. And that means they can access their product throughout the winter and periodically sell it to the Boston Fish Market or a restaurant that they might have a contract with. And obviously the most expensive form of storage is the pod, because that I'm using a lot of electricity for still, even though it's reduced, and I'm feeding them as well. And there's a lot of care and feeding and handling that goes hand in hand with that. So those are the three options in bath. But going back to my original industry survey, I was concerned that if there was a hatchery loss at some point, then that would obviously have an impact on my customers, and that would have an impact on me eventually because they wouldn't have as much product. So the Mid-Coast Council of Governments reached out to me not this past July, but previous July, to see what my interest is in a hatchery that had just come up for sale down in Harpswell. I don't know how many of you guys read the Press Herald. I read it religiously, sometimes too much, but there's been a lot of very bad coverage of a company called Running Tide as of late that folded last month. It was a venture capital funding company. They had $74 million that they blew through in 4 years. I don't know how they did that, but they did. And their whole initial premise was to basically, so they took, who's everybody familiar with Mitchell Field down in Harpswell? So when I was working with the state, I gave Harpswell 4 grants to try and figure out what to do with Mitchell Field. And the 5th grant they gave me, they wanted to do an assessment of the assessments. And I'm like, no, guys, you've had $200,000, figure it out. And 15 years later, or not 15, 10 years later, I'm the only business down there now. So it's kind of ironic. The town clerk was like, oh, yeah, I remember your name when we were doing the grant stuff. I'm like, yeah, that's me. So they took the old fire station, Running Tide did, and outfitted it as a hatchery. They've also put in a massive vinyl Quonset hut right next to it. So the production capacity for seed down in Harpswell is around 500 million, which makes it one of the largest hatcheries on the East Coast. But Running Tide didn't use it for that. They were trying to patent a big aluminum barge that could grow just quickly, similar to the pod, except it was in the ocean. And they built the hatchery specifically to supply themselves with seed and no one else. So this hatchery's never produced commercially before, but the staff was just ridiculously well. Some of the brightest people I've ever met. And most of them left about 2 years ago when Running Tide switched over to their kelp carbon sequestration initiative because they could make a lot more money on the carbon market than they could with shellfish. And of course, that is what led the company to fail. And unfortunately, my purchase of the hatchery was associated with several of those articles as like, this is a related link, click on this one. And like in the paper, it was not cool, but whatever. Can't help it. So purchased the hatchery in February of this year as the official closing with a lot of investors, 2 very benevolent individuals who want to see aquaculture succeed. They've made their billions. They don't really care right now. They just want to make sure that, as I do, there's another protein source available from the sea and that people can keep eating it. That's really the 2 criteria these guys make their investments with. So I kind of lucked out in that regard. The pictures you're seeing here, so Mary Meeting Shellfish is the overarching company. Muddy River Farm still exists. It's just basically my aquaponics setup in my backyard now. Mary Meeting Shellfish is the mothership. We are the only domestically owned hatchery left in the state. The other 2 hatcheries were just recently purchased by the Ontario Teachers Pension Fund. So it's good for me because I can, use the whole buy local thing and hit people over the head with it. But at the same time, these 2 other hatcheries can coordinate and try to Uber me out of business by dropping prices and then jacking them up when I'm out. But that's not going to happen. My product is superior. I also have the cleanest water source in Middle Bay and Harpswell by far. The other two are located in the Damariscotta, so there are issues there. So now instead of relying on farmers just for seed, I make my own seed. And I bring about a quarter of that seed up to Bath to put in the pods and grow that out over the year. You can get about $14 per thousand for 2 millimeter seed, but I can get $50 per thousand for 10 millimeter seed. So it's not linear, it's definitely exponential in terms of the price increase by size. So I'll bring a quarter of this product at 2 millimeters up to Bath, grow it out, and sell larger seed throughout the year. And obviously reserve 3/4 of the pods for farmers for their overwinter storage. So that's some of the algae I was talking about. That's not the hatchery. We have an entire building full of those things which are called K-tubes, and they are specifically for feeding the oysters. We start algae production in December typically and reach critical mass around the middle of January, and then we're able to start spawning. This is our quarantine room. This is where all the magic happens with the oysters. We'll simulate a summer day in July by alternating the temperature up and down. Females will release, they'll put on gonad, and then we'll do the whole lab mixing thing of male and female parts, and bada bing. You take that water and put it into a big conical tank, and in 1 week you'll have little swimming larvae all over the place. And eventually, they'll look like this. So this is what, probably 3/4 millimeter seed. It takes about 3 weeks from larval phase to them looking like that. And then typically an oyster farmer will buy a 2 millimeter seed. That's what most farmers like because they're able to control the process throughout its entire life, essentially, and try to control that flavor as well. And they know, like anybody, they like to keep an eye on their stuff, right? So like if they buy it at 2 millimeters, then they're keeping an eye on their stuff for a while. Yeah,
This is all brand new to me.
sure.
That being said, do you sell to international companies, or is it strictly the Northeast?
No, so I sell all the way down in North Carolina. But the majority of my sales happen either in Cape Cod or in Maine. And that's because, I mean, the Eastern oyster is native to the East Coast. Like, I don't sell to Pacific farms because there's a Pacific oyster over there which tastes like a bunch of pennies, so don't eat that crap. You want the East Coast oyster. And then,
Potential for you to sell internationally based on
no, because the Europeans have their own oyster as well. The European oyster, which you could actually find several. If you go out and look hard enough, you can find European oysters in Maine. They're much rounder in shape and a little bit bigger, but they're not commercially viable, or they're not sold commercially over here because they're not supposed to be sold commercially. Because if you begin mixing species, then you don't have the solid Eastern oyster that people look for, which again is far superior to any other product that you can get. There is a potential, I think, for the pod itself in other countries, especially Southeast Asia. I'm going to be throwing some sea urchins into the big green tank this year to see how they do. The market in Japan especially is huge for urchins, the urchin roe especially. And for me, they'll just keep the tank clean until they get big enough because they'll eat all the algae off the sides, and then I can make more money off of selling them overseas. So it's a win-win. But yeah, eventually I'd like to license the pod technology, but I want to make my first $1 million off of that first, and then we can talk about that.
have you considered other areas of shellfish that you grow and their oysters, their clams,
Yep.
etc.?
That's a good question, actually. So last year we grew 500 million quahog seed, of which I sold about 100 million, and the rest we donated to the town of Brunswick. So I better get some credit for that from the town council here too, and I have to talk to Walker. He resigned, right? But he'll be back. I mean, let's be honest here. He's getting back on there. There's an at-large seat, right? So quahogs, they aren't great for traditional aquaculture because they live in mud. But a lot of towns in Maine, and nonprofits for that matter, like Manomet, TNC, will buy quahog seed from a hatchery at a very small size, grow it in what's called an upwell. It looks like a big table, except it's got 8 silos. And you put very small seed in there, stick it in the ocean, and the seed will get very large over the summer. And so then the town will take that seed and broadcast it all over their flats. And that's what makes the quahog fishing industry up here viable right now. It was never a huge industry in Maine. Softshell clams, steamers have always been the thing, right? So they're also a lot more susceptible to climate change than quahogs are, because quahogs are hard, much more hardy growing up in the hatchery as well. And because the flats don't freeze over anymore, the green crab population is exploding out there, and green crabs are the primary predator for softshell clams. So last year, Ellen had mentioned MRF Consulting. I have a very small firm where I do marine resource assessments, which really just involves my mid-20s staff taking the airboat out and counting clams all day, which is a lot of fun for them. But last year was the first year that we had actually seen a quahog population, a projected quahog population that was larger than softshell clams in Brunswick, that's never happened before. And it's a product of a couple of things. One, the town is stocking quahogs, so it's artificially inflated. But on the other hand, green crabs are decimating the softshell clam population in Maine. It's not just in Brunswick; it's in Waldoboro, Scarborough, some of the larger shellfish towns in the state in terms of volume. So, long answer to your question, long answer. Short answer, I do grow quahogs. I also have surf clams, which are not a big thing in Maine at all, but they connect very well with what I do with offshore wind. In the mid-Atlantic, there's an effort right now, completely different fishery than what you see up here. Up here we have 6,000 owner-operators, small businesses. In the mid-Atlantic, you have maybe 18, and they own everything. They have huge fleets of boats, 18 companies. So it's a lot easier to deal with them, honestly. And if a wind farm developer wants to go in, off Long Island or off of Maryland or something like that, they're going to have to pay into a regional mitigation fund, a pretty steep amount as well. And that funding then goes to compensate fishermen after they make a claim if the wind farm is disrupting their revenue because the wind farm's in the area. Don't ask me how this is going to function, because they're just setting themselves up for failure. It's a great concept, but how are you going to prove where somebody goes? I mean, fishermen hate getting tracked, so a lot of them will keep AIS or VMS off their vessels. Larger vessels have to have it, so it's a little bit easier. But this fund will help compensate lost revenue, but it will also set up research funds for creating new fishing grounds outside of where that wind farm is, if they can't fish in the wind farm. And most wind farms have no issues with fishing. It's the insurance companies for the fishing boat that have the issue. So whenever you hear about wind farms taking everyone's ocean space, it's not the wind farm, it's the insurance company. Always goes back to insurance. And not the farm's insurance, the fisherman's insurance. So in the mid-Atlantic, surf clams are huge. It's a huge industry. They're used in chowder. They're actually pretty decent, steamed as well. And Rutgers, who I have a relationship with for research, Rutgers University down in New Jersey, they're working on creating a new ecosystem basically just over the state boundary line in federal waters where they don't need a permit, because all the states have these very long, drawn-out permitting processes for siting aquaculture. The feds have been working on it for 25 years, and we still don't have a process. So they're taking advantage of that lack of action and basically planting new surf clam beds just over the federal boundary line. And that creates new fishing space for folks who otherwise might have been excluded from the new wind farm. So Running Tide, my predecessor, sold quite a bit of surf clam broodstock or seed to Rutgers, and Rutgers then planted it. I wasn't aware of that relationship until July. I was down at a conference on Long Island for offshore wind, and there was a woman there, professor at Rutgers, who was showing pictures of this amazing-looking surf clam stock because they've been monitoring the site offshore with cameras. And she's like, "Yeah, we got this from the Northeast about 3 years ago." And I'm like, "Wait, that's mine. That's my broodstock. That's fantastic, good stuff." And so, they're estimating they need 8 billion seed over the next 10 years to make this work. And my max is 400 million or 600 million at the hatchery. So take that into consideration when you're thinking about the scale of what's needed for compensation. It's pretty. Yeah, by all means. Mm-hmm.
And you use any type of solar power to generate this process.
So I do have solar panels on the roof and bath. I'll answer your questions backwards. The second question is the second piece of that at the hatchery is a fantastic question. I had an $8,000 electricity bill in July this year, which just blew my socks off. I was not expecting that, and that's because Mitchell Field doesn't have water, sewer, really crappy. No internet. I have to use Elon, unfortunately, and very bad power goes off all the time. So I leased the back 5 acres behind the hatchery in anticipation of putting in a solar field. Revision beat me to the punch. They can't touch my 5 acres yet, but Revision put in a 5-acre solar farm proposal to the town this year for Mitchell Field. The select board did not endorse it, but I don't really care who puts them up. As long as I can plug in and get a solid electricity rate, I don't care if it's Revision. It'd be cheaper if it were mine, but I'm okay with locking in because they build a 5-acre solar farm. I could easily take up a quarter of that, so they'd have this guaranteed industrial user. My other big power suck is my desalination unit because there's no water down there. So all the fresh water we have to desalinate. And when that thing is on, you can literally see the electricity meter just spinning around and around and around, and it's not fun. So I'm drilling a well this fall because I'm done with the desal unit. I'm not getting another $8,000 electricity bill. And that's only at half capacity. So God knows what it's going to be next summer. So solar, yes. In terms of expansion, I'm 42. I got 2 little kids. I just want to. I want to make some money enough to set aside and then start licensing the pod and take a break. I haven't had a vacation in 8 years, so I'm very much looking forward to next month, where I think I'll be able to just sit back for a little bit and get some stuff done around the house. But yeah, it's been a drive. The other thing I will mention. There isn't currently a hatchery in the United States that offers scallop seed, and that is like the holy grail of aquaculture because per pound or by volume, it is easily the most expensive product you can grow. There's maybe 17 oyster farm or scallop farms in the state. And right now, they have to go out and basically collect wild seed, which of course the guys who drag for scallops hate because you're taking baby scallops that they will eventually harvest in 4 years out of the system and putting it into your own cage for your own benefit. So there's this really use conflict going on right now between the wild harvesters and the aquaculturists, which is never a good thing. No one's been able to make seed work financially because the larval period from when they hatch to when they get shell is about 30 days, whereas with oysters it's 13. So while they're in that larval phase, they're using a lot of electricity, a lot of water, a lot of feed, and it really adds to the overhead. So no one's really tried to do it before. Plus, you have to keep the temperature at 15°C constant. It can't fluctuate at all. So the insulation, the amount of HVAC you need just for that one small cohort of seed is pretty significant. So my operations director hatched 2 cohorts around 15 days each for larval period when he was working for UMaine. Then I poached him. And now he's my operations director. He is convinced that we can do this, so we put in a grant application to USDA SBIR 2 weeks ago. So cross your fingers. But it would be the first offering of its kind in terms of commercial scale scallop seed. So definitely trying to diversify product offerings because you can't put all your eggs in one basket like one particular dominant ocean industry does up here, which I won't mention. Yes, sir.
How's the recent discharge of PFAS chemicals into the Amazon impact the aquaculture industry?
Not us so much. My hatchery, nothing. I mean, I'm already on a brownfield. That's what Mitchell Field is. It's the old Navy refueling depot. The Navy mitigated it, right? But I'm sure 6 feet down there's some nasty stuff. The water that I take from Harpswell, or from Middle Bay, we have to have tested very rigorously for DEP to give us what's called a NIPD's discharge permit. So we haven't seen much of anything in the 1 year I've been operating in terms of harmful chemicals. With my consulting work, I actually did PFAS monitoring in Muir Creek and Harpswell Cove last summer. So it was incredibly timely. We took a bunch of zebra mussels, blue mussels, oysters, clams, and I hate to say this, but we did electroshock some fish because we needed to look at their tissue as well. It sounds much more horrible than it is. But, so we did find elevated levels of PFAS already in Harpswell Cove, and that's because it's drainage directly from the base.
Would it be into the baseline for?
That's I've been trying to get Brunswick to respond to my calls, but I don't think the town wants to talk about it yet in that regard. So I'm okay with waiting. I mean, they're paying my bills in other ways with our marine resource assessments, but baseline would be ideal, and I have that data. So if there's a way that that can be used for comparison's sake, I'm all about it.
I just wanted to make sure you finished telling us all the things you wanted to tell us. Just move into the question.
Oh, no worries. I think that is it. Yeah, I mean, just the people who funded me. I got running tide on there, and then that's the prototype operational. That's only a third scale, so it's about 6 feet across in the barn. And that was my part-time staff member, Ashley, in the background. And yeah, I think it was that was in the spring. But this basically took up the entire first floor of the barn. Doug,
Why are there only 3 hatcheries now?
there used to be 17.
So what's the barrier to entry?
It's not like growing a cow or even an oyster for that matter in a lease. It's literal lab science. So you have to have people who understand, how much CO2 is in a system, how much feed to add, the appropriate temperature. They have to know how to use peristaltic pumps. I mean, it runs the gamut. This is not what you would normally find in your average farmer. So these guys have to have advanced degrees, which obviously adds cost to labor. And then the whole facility itself, I mean, I mentioned the $8,000 electricity bill, but I've got gas bills. I have to pay Musk for really crappy internet. I have to basically pay, I think I'm paying like 5 or 6 bills a week at this point for operations, and they're all different bills. It's amazing. It's good stuff. That's basically all I do at this point is pay bills and cash checks, of course. But it's tough, I guess, is the short answer. It's really difficult to do, and if you have a catastrophic loss and you don't have an investor sitting behind you, then you're done. So it's not really worth other people's time to try and stand something up like this. I wouldn't have done it myself if Running Tide hadn't offered to sell me their hatchery, because the amount of equipment in that building is just astounding. Tanks everywhere, algae tubes, pumps, backup pumps, backup pumps. I mean, everything. It's nuts.
So you to one side, is that the barrier to expansion of increasing hatchery capacity?
What was the first word you said?
Well, rather than, are you going to expand? To expand the whole industry?
No, we don't want that. No, with my business hat off, yes, we do want that. All right, I'm going to try and stay diplomatic here. Our current marine resource management regime, which again, as I mentioned, has been there for quite some time, is very, very, very lobster-centric. And for good reason. I mean, it's easily the largest fishery in the state in terms of volume and revenue. That won't be forever, but we're going to keep sticking our head in the sand for as long as we possibly can and milk this thing for all it's worth. And that's more or less DMR's view on the matter. So aquaculture gets an incredibly short shrift. Since I quit in 2019, their staff has turned over twice in the aquaculture division. So not only do you have not the best leadership, but you have to complete greenhorns who know nothing about hatcheries. And they're the ones who are supposed to be inspecting them, making sure you're not discharging bleach and all that good stuff, giving you approval to get your NIPTES permit from DEP. So it's just it's a conflagration of a lot of unfortunate things. The complication of standing up a hatchery, making sure that you can get the word out and market, competing with the Canadians because they bought a hatchery down in Virginia as well. There's a lot of concern in the main industry that if PEI loses an oyster cohort, all of that seed that's at Muscungus and Mook is going to get shipped up there to support that industry. And the Canadians really support their aquaculture industry. It's amazing what they do up there. I wish Maine did it, but that'll never happen in the United States. It's way too much corporate welfare. But so yeah, it's a puzzle. I guess is the best way to put it. And I'm trying to put the pieces together.
What governing bodies do you have to answer to in terms of operations? So I think of like hospitals that are,
hmm
postal and things like that.
So main DEP, main DMR, Marine Resources and Environmental Protection, and the main Submerged Lands Program, which is at the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. And that's really it. We have to, each one of the cohorts that we send out to a farm, we have to have a very tiny subset of that tested at a lab. And we have to make sure that the results that come back before we ship it are good, because we don't want to be responsible for spreading MSX or ROD, juvenile disease, all over the Northeast. And then so we'll get those results back, and we just have to keep those on file in the event that DMR ever audits us for our testing. But
How many people do you employ?
10 right now, and I'm going to hire 2 more this fall. I need somebody to help me with paying bills. I can't. It's not what I want to spend the rest of my life doing. Yes, sir.
The seed oyster company that works out of the Meadows Marina, they're finding that their seed oysters mature to the point that they sell them
hmm
2 to 3 weeks earlier
Yep.
than they used to because of warming the water and also the oxygen level is dropping.
Hmm.
Do you see the oyster industry, the aquaculture industry, moving down east as well?
I don't think so. They're pretty hardy animals, and we haven't seen any pathogens or disease yet that alters the physical look, which is, I know it sounds, it is incredibly superficial because it is superficial, but I mean that's how you move your product, is it looks attractive, which is why lobsters with shell disease, you can eat them, they taste fine, but they just look like hell, so they're not going to sell. But we haven't seen anything like that with shellfish yet. Fingers crossed. Whatever is down in New York right now that is brewing that nobody knows about doesn't get up here. We did have one really weird issue this summer, and we weren't the only ones. There was another hatchery down on Long Island on Fisher's Island, where seed would get to about 1.5 mil, and then it would stop growing. It wouldn't die; it just wouldn't grow anymore. So there's a group at URI that has a NOAA grant, federal grant, to basically accumulate hatchery losses and try and figure out what was going on. They ran some genetic studies on product that we sent them, and I get those results back next month. But I'm really hoping it's not another pathogen. That would not be cool. It's something else to be concerned about. But yeah, I mean they're hardy. I mean half the time oysters are out of water in the natural environment anyway, so they can sustain 2 to 3 months at staying alive while not having access to the ocean. So if there's a harmful algal bloom or something and they have to be removed from the lease and put into a freezer, that's okay. Can't do that with oysters or with lobsters or fish. I guess you could freeze the fish, right? But yeah, feed the dog. Yes, sir.
Focus name CI, a big acronym that aquaculture.
Mm-hmm.
Have you benefited from
CEI, no. I've given them several tours. They had a decent backlog, and a lot of the funding they used it's federal funding that comes to FAME and then gets distributed to economic development companies like CEI. And the name of that funding is escaping me, but there was a significant delay, obviously because of what's going on with Congress, how we can't pass a budget ever. So things get pushed back and pushed back. And so by the time the last glut of funding came in for CEI assistance to companies like mine, it had already been spoken for because they had a backlog of applications. CEI likes to invest in companies. I think they're a little bit farther along. I've been around for 6 years now, but they still consider me a startup for some reason. And Focus Maine, I was part of an accelerator with them, so they did help out quite a bit. But CEI, not so much. Not yet. Maybe soon. Let's see. I want to keep my debt as low as possible. You look puzzled.
So, this is really fascinating. I've learned so much. If your industry were, I hate to use the word annihilated,
Oh, no, so I explained that poorly. So in order to create a farm, any type of shellfish farm, you need a lease from the Maine Submerged Lands Program because you're using bottom that is publicly owned. Don't get me started on why lobstermen don't need to do that, but we do. So you have to get a lease from the state, and then you have to go through this very rigorous permitting process where a landowner who doesn't want to see your farm could basically destroy all your plans just by suing you repeatedly over the years and draining all your financial resources. And I never happened to me, but I've seen it happen to other farms. So there's a very rigorous permitting process involved for state leases, and state owns out to 3 nautical miles, typically. There's some exceptions around the country, like west coast of Florida is 9, same with Texas. But after 3 nautical miles, the feds take over ownership and jurisdiction out to 200 nautical miles. In Maine, we got shafted by the Hague in like the 70s, so the Gulf of Maine is split like this, so the Canadians have the bulk of it. So we don't have a whole lot of room to go east when it comes to fishing. The feds have never established a formal leasing or permitting process for aquaculture in federal waters. It's never happened. I don't really know why. There's been obviously a lot of pressure from wild harvest fisheries about we don't want any of that in our water. Plus, it's going to be a lot harder offshore to farm than it is inshore because it's obviously much deeper. It's going to take forever to get out there. If there's a storm, you're done. If you're a fish farm and those big geodesic domes, right, and one of those things gets loose and broken, I mean, you've got a genetically altered species all over the Gulf, which, I mean, at this point, we've killed everything out there anyway, so what the deuce? Why not add a few more? But, yeah, so I think those are some of the problems that arise whenever the feds try to do this. But they also, NOAA doesn't have permitting capacity for this type of thing either. So you'd have to essentially build a brand new program at a federal agency, which in 2024 is less than impossible. So yeah, that's the world we find ourselves in. But right now, if I wanted to put a farm out there, I could go throw a bunch of buoys and get away with it because there's no law that says I can't. No problem. Cool. I didn't go into as much ecosystem stuff as you had asked, but I mean, there's a lot of material to cover.
I just wanted to say the library has asked us, since they're going to be using this room for something else in the morning, if you could stay, if you're able, to help us back here.
But we thank you very much, and we may have you back to talk about it.
Certainly. That's what the consulting bit does.
That's
So yes.
So thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Good questions.